Dun, 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 dun. Hey everybody. So we're actually going to continue talking about a lot of those things that are going on in the north. So basically, last time in the last video, talked about how much things are changing. Something that's usually kind of just a fact is when things are changing rapidly, like they were in the north, right? More and more people moving to the cities, more and more factories, more and more industrialization. A lot of times that causes many of the things that were wrong in society or were ailing society to kind of come to the surface. And that means a lot of people are going to want to have what we call reform. Reform just means change. Okay, and there's still people who are called reformers now and want change in society one way or the other. There's going to be a lot of people in this era that we call the era of reform before the Civil War who want these changes to happen. And they tend to be in the north. Because when you put everyone together in cities, you get them involved in an industrial economy where a lot of times you can be a factory worker and not live the best life, and you see a lot of kind of the moral failings of people. That's going to cause people to want reform. So one of the big causes of these reforms is the changing nature of society at the time. The second cause is a huge deal, something called the Second Great Awakening. It came right after the First Great Awakening. Well, maybe not right after, but it came after it. And the Great Awakening is what we call a religious revival. That just means that basically people are taking their religion more seriously. And it's tough to really gauge with our modern kind of sense because in the 1800s, if you met one of these people, one of these Americans, they're all probably going to be more religious than us in the way that it's just a part of their daily life and um, even being able to throw out, like just say and quote verbatim passages from the Bible and things. But during these Great Awakenings, people would get together a lot of times in the woods. They'd build big stages, and preachers would get to talk, and people would share ideas and have new interpretations of religion. So, with this Great Awakening, people are taking their religion more seriously once again, and that means that people are going to want to have society kind of take that religion very seriously, and they want to change society for the better. So, changing nature of the world around them, right? North is becoming an industrial society, along with the Great Awakening, are going to trigger a lot of these reforms. One of the main drivers of these reforms that's maybe different from earlier times in history is that there's going to be a lot more women involved. So women's reform is in itself a whole issue. You can look up, you can research the Seneca Falls Convention, which happened in 1848 and called for the equal rights of women. And in a lot of these other reform movements that I'm going to touch on oh so briefly, women are a huge part. They are the leaders of a lot of these reform movements. So women's rights is in itself a reform movement, and it's not going to really accomplish one of its main goals, which would be the right to vote, until much, much later in American history. But at this time, in the 1840s and 50s, women are becoming more visible in society. Women are working in factories, they're starting to go to universities, and they're taking a leading role in some of these other social reform movements. So the first one I'll talk about has to do with prison and asylum reform. So essentially, prisons have never been a nice place, and they're still probably not. But back in the day, in the 1800s, they were very, very unpleasant places. And there was a woman named Dorothea Dix, or I guess just Dorothea. I've never really heard anyone say it. I've only read it. So she basically went undercover, and she went into these prisons, and she was a journalist. So she wrote about what she actually saw. And essentially, how prisons used to work is you would just take everyone who had committed whatever crime it was, and you would throw them in jail in a big room with everyone else of all ages and genders, and it didn't matter. There wasn't really anywhere to sleep specifically. They were just sitting. They were just held. And it was absolutely terrible conditions. So she wrote about these conditions, called for them to change. That's the number one thing she did. Number two, she realized that many, many people who were in jail were debtors, and we talked about that all the way back in colonial times. And it's still an issue in America. So people end up in prison simply because they can't pay their debts. They haven't done anything violent, but they can't pay their debts. You end up in prison. Anyway, the next thing that's going to happen that she realizes is many of the people who are in prison are simply mentally ill. So that means that they can't fit in with society, can't follow all the same rules of society. But they aren't getting treatment. No one's trying to help them. It's just that they put them in prison because they got nowhere else for them to go. So she pushes for, and there's a whole movement that develops around something called asylums, where you can treat folks who are mentally ill or have some sort of mental handicap rather than simply throwing them in jail, which is obviously a terrible, terrible solution. Another reform movement was the temperance movement, and that means that you shouldn't drink any alcohol. They believe that alcohol should be banned from society. So when you're living on the farm, and you got to remember that for a long time America was called the Whiskey Republic. Okay, people were very, very heavy drinkers. When you're living on the farm, you're working all day, you're not near a ton of people, they might not realize and see that as a problem. But once you move people into cities and they're industrial workers, you can see that drunkenness becomes a huge issue. These reformers are active all throughout the 1800s, and they get some states and counties and things to pass laws against alcohol. And we end up with the 18th Amendment, which eventually bans alcohol, but that won't be until the 1900s, which is after our class is over. The other kind of a great thing that comes out of these reform movements is from a guy named Horace Mann, and he looks around at schooling. There are such things as public schools at this time, but he is the one who kind of sets the framework for a public school system like we have today, where you have like the local taxation, and you're going to have a lot more public schools or a lot more public schools in a lot more places around the country than before. And he gets it to where education until at least like the 8th grade is pretty common. His whole goal in this is that everyone should be able to read and write, so that you can read your Bible and understand it and be a good citizen, or so rather, be a good Christian, which is going to make you a good citizen. So what are we going to do with all this? And I left out, I meant to mention at the beginning of this video, but I left out probably the biggest reform movement for our specific class, which is actually going to be the abolition movement, and that's going to be its own video rather than being lumped in here. But basically, what can you do with all this? Well, in the South, you have a more conservative culture. Many people are invested in things remaining the same. Okay, they're agrarian, agricultural, plantation-style agriculture, that is, slavery. In the North, things are already changing. Things are dynamic, would be a good word, right? We're getting more and more people moving to the cities to work in factories, more and more people who are in charge or invest in that economy, and with that you see a lot of issues. And so there's this kind of feeling of reform, and a lot of it is religious. And so a lot of that even is going to come out with the Civil War, where people are saying that, you know, maybe God is on the north side, because they're fighting against things like slavery. So I'm going to talk more about that abolition piece in the next video. But that's just a little bit more zest for you to know about the North, learn about that era, because we still live with a lot of those reforms today, a lot of those changes today, so it's pretty darn important. I'll see you next time.